My name is Almut Gadow. I'm a German Peruvian lawyer, a legal academic. I taught law at the Open University's School of Law for almost 10 years. The idea of infusing academic teaching with the dominant political ideology of the day is something that touched a nerve in me, because my family has lived through 2 totalitarian dictatorships in Germany and has had very direct experience of it. My paternal grandparents were actually at university when the Nazis took power in 1933. So their curriculum was, as it were, Nazified while they were doing their degrees. So my grandparents were actually reading theology, both of them at different universities. To pass the official exam, they would have had to teach the Führer principle, so the idea of absolute obedience to Hitler and absolute obedience to any sort of Nazi leader in power. They would have had to preach that from the pulpit and teach that that is integral to Christianity, or they would have had to teach Jewish guilt and teach that Nazi anti-Semitism is an integral part of Christianity. And they disagreed with that to the point where they decided that they couldn't graduate from this official Nazified institution anymore, and decided to take their exams at an illegal underground institution instead. And with that sort of set off on a path of being part of a dissident movement, which ultimately led to my grandparents, or my grandfather in particular, being sentenced to death. So luckily he did survive and went on to father my father. But of course, as far as his university is concerned, no sooner had the swastika then come down than the hammer and sickle went up. We then get the same sort of experiences in relation to the infusion of all academic research and teaching with the socialist and Marxist ideology. So we've got various members of the family on my mother's side who just didn't get into university, not for academic reasons, but because they, as the expression was, failed to develop a socialist personality. We've got other members of the family who didn't sort of progress within academia because they, as the expression was, failed to display socialist consciousness in their academic work. And again, if any of the academic work that you did in those days didn't ultimately support socialist doctrine, you essentially weren't a good academic. In that sense, the way you position yourself in relation to the ideology of the current regime has always been quite personally relevant to me. It's not just an abstract question. Where you stand and where you put your academic work in relation to the ideology that has the current regime in power is a fundamental ethical question, and it is a question by which, from a very early age, I learned to judge people around me by. So when I was then told that I now had to incorporate into my teaching at the Open University various critical social justice ideologies to liberate the law curriculum, or because the EDI department had decided that they were going to modify all curriculum and make it anti-racist and intersectional and whatnot. That's not just something you slightly pay lip service to me. That's not something I'm just going to do because, well, my managers have asked me to do it. So in some ways, that was probably what motivated me to object when managers in the Open University Law School started telling us that we had to do our bit to help liberate the curriculum by teaching students certain ideologies as though they were objective fact. So I think it's no surprise to anyone that the university was moving more towards the critical social justice ideologies around the start of the 2020s, because just about everybody was at that time. And the EDI department was more open about the fact that they wanted to have a direct influence on the substantive content of what was being taught at the university at the time, and said as much as in their EDI plan. And in some ways, the law school was perhaps just the testing ground for that, because it so happened that we completely rewrote the law degree at that point for reasons which were just to do with the teaching of law, or it wasn't particularly ideological. But the teaching director then made a decision that liberating the curriculum was to be, as she put it, the core theme of all teaching under the new law degree. And they then, amongst other things, created a sort of tick box checklist against which every unit of teaching, so everything a law student studies in every single week of their entire degree, had to be audited. They hired undergraduate interns to check all teaching materials against this tick box list. So there was a conscious decision to make sure that in every week of all law teaching, students would, in various ways, be exposed to these new intersectional ideologies. And I started questioning that actually in relation to various things, because it led to some quite absurd outcomes, to some quite absurd bits of teaching content that probably weren't intended on several subjects that I taught. And in most instances on other modules, when I questioned it, the response was what you normally get when you question an aspect of teaching material. Managers would say, okay, yeah, fair point, thanks, we'll have another look at that. And then, a few months down the line, the materials might change or they might not for the next presentation. And I almost expected much of the same to happen when I questioned the teaching of genderism as part of the new criminal law module. But that really wasn't the case. So when I started asking questions about the teaching of gender identity belief as part of criminal law, the response was pretty much instantly, we're not changing anything here. The materials are staying as they are. You will teach gender identity belief to your students. The subject is closed. We will not answer further questions about this. I really felt at the time that just telling me we're not going to discuss it, but you will teach it to your student wasn't really a satisfactory answer. So in that sense, when my managers tried to tell me what I have to teach my students in a specific tutorial, I think I'm entitled to at least ask for an explanation, to ask them to tell me where that comes from, to tell me their sources, to explain the logic behind it, to define the core concepts, which was what I was doing. And the only answer I got from my managers whenever I asked these questions was really no debate. I was highlighting cases that were going through the courts, highlighting cases of offenders that are currently going through the penal system, to point out again and again what the implications of just unquestioningly incorporating genderism in the operation of criminal justice would be. And generally, when I made these posts, always on a forum for criminal law tutors at the Open University, there was no substantive response from managers. The most common reaction would be that they just deleted my posts, archived my posts, closed the threads. So whatever I had asked or said, they would just move out of sight, so none of my colleagues could see it anymore. And that was the sum total of their response. Among my fellow tutors, there were a couple who agreed with me and said as much, a couple who disagreed with me and said as much, quite a few who didn't express a view one way or another in relation to questions of gender and its incorporation into the teaching of law. Well, even the fellow tutors who disagreed with me, actually, interestingly, did not take any of the positions that management then ultimately took. So the colleagues who disagreed with my gender critical views, they would respond to my speech with more academic speech. So I might post something and they would reply, Almut, I don't agree with you, and here is why I don't agree with you. What none of my fellow tutors did at any point was the current cancel culturist thing of saying, oh, I feel harmed by your ideas, you should be stopped from expressing these ideas, management, come help protect me from these ideas. There was nothing of that going on. Quite the contrary, having had disclosure from the Open University now, I can see instances of actually my line manager writing to somebody who had disagreed with me and effectively trying to get that person to make a complaint about me, and that person saying, no, thank you, I just felt the need to respond to what Almut had said. The managers then very cleverly waited to the end of the academic year until I'd finished my teaching for the academic year and finished my marking for the academic year. I believe the modules all ended on the 30th of June. On the 4th of July, my manager told me that they were now going to initiate a disciplinary investigation into the posts that I made raising these points. And at that point, I was then told that apparently I had been bullying and harassing my managers in asking them essentially to explain and define some of the core concepts that they wanted us to introduce in the teaching of criminal law, and that I had violated the transgender staff policy, which seemed particularly absurd because the transgender staff policy is about what you do when a member of staff comes out as trans, which just wasn't a situation that had arisen, but because the transgender staff policies starts with a comment along the lines of the university is committed to creating an environment that is trans inclusive. They said, because you've said things trans people might not like, you've therefore violated the transgender staff policy. They also said that I had failed to comply with a management instruction, which seemed similarly absurd because nobody had ever given me an instruction not to make these posts. So on those 4 grounds, they then started a disciplinary investigation, which predictably then led to full disciplinary hearing, which was held in my absence, actually outside my working hours, arranged at half a week's notice for a time where they knew I wouldn't be available and would be on an airplane and therefore not able to join. And then I was summarily dismissed for the gross misconduct of having questioned the teaching of genderism as part of a criminal law module. The whole process was so much of a farce, so much of a kangaroo court. Every part of the process was entirely made up using procedures that are just not known to employment law, let alone university procedures. Everything about the process was a farce. It was completely clear from the outset, really, that they were going to be sacking me over this. Yes, I was a member of the University and College Union. In fact, I was an elected trade union representative. During the internal processes, I really couldn't have had better support from the trade union. Once I was sacked, it became a little more difficult because the University and College Union has a rule that they will only let their members use lawyers who are Stonewall champions. If a law firm has signed up to a scheme under which they promise to be advocates and agents of Stonewall ideology, and I have been sacked for questioning Stonewall ideology, I have been sacked for questioning whether I should be teaching Stonewall law. It just seems to me that lawyers who've committed to representing Stonewall in everything they do are not the right people to represent me in challenging that decision. And that's why ultimately I decided to crowdfund my case rather than use UCE lawyers. It is actually my expression that the belief in gender identity isn't that pronounced or deeply held, specifically within the law school. If you've read Jo Phoenix's witness statement, you may have noticed she actually says that the only school in the university from which nobody signed the open letter against the Gender Critical Research Network was the law school. Didn't particularly surprise me. Conversely, there was at some point an open letter from legal academics across the whole UK in support of Kathleen Stock shortly before she left Sussex. 2 people at Europe's largest law school signed that. So there was never really a sign of this being an issue that our managers were particularly committed to in the Faculty of Law. It was only, as far as I could gauge, at the point where this became a very public war between the Open University and its Gender Critical Research Network that law school management even properly woke up to the issue. And they woke up to the issue, I got the impression, in the sense of saying, oh, there's a pile on. I can further my career by taking the university's side in this battle. Every time I asked managers to explain even the basics of the gender identity belief that we were supposed to convey now through our teaching, they just didn't have an answer. They didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to define it, I suspect, because they'd never been particularly interested in it. It suddenly became really interesting when you could show that you were on management side by promoting genderism through your teaching. I certainly believe that it's a case of careerism and opportunism, that those are the motives that Open University managers have, especially in the Faculty of Business and Law, in supporting these liberating the curriculum ideologies. And coming back then to my family's own experiences in the past, that is certainly something my family has experienced before. You will often find that the same people who were fervent supporters of the Kaiser in 1917 were then fervent supporters of the Weimar Republic in 1927, and fervent supporters of Hitler in 1937, and fervent supporters of socialism in 1947, because you can fit all these 4 into a working life and into one career. People who through their work supported one regime after another were always supporting one and the same thing, which is their own personal gain. I have even a lot less respect for people who support these kind of extreme ideologies, not because they in any way believe in them, but because they know they can further their careers by supporting them right now. On the other hand, it makes me slightly hopeful because you know that the minute this stops being conducive to your career, people will stop persecuting gender critical academics. Having been sacked, I've now brought an Employment Tribunal case against the Open University in which I argue that I was harassed and discriminated against and unfairly dismissed because of my gender critical beliefs and also because of my beliefs in academic freedom. We're hoping really to, with my case, create a test case for the ability of universities in particular to sack academics for the things they say in the course of academic debates, which is essentially what happened to me. It doesn't often happen, even in these days of cancel culture, it doesn't often happen that universities are open about the fact that they've treated what an academic said on their subject in the course of academic debate is gross misconduct and is a sacking offence. But that's what happened in my case. And we just want the Employment Tribunal, really hopefully, in its decision in my case, to spell out very clearly the way that human rights law already implies the right to academic freedom into our employment contracts as academics.